I have told this story more times than I should for someone who prided herself for being quiet. People in our cul-de-sac assumed I liked the background, the kind of neighbor who watered her plants at dawn, whose kids graduated and left, who baked bread and waved. My name's Evelyn, not that it matters. Names here are like flags you put in your yard. They mean something until someone pulls them out. Hearthstone Court was the sort of place your relatives wanted to retire to, with matching brick mailboxes and 3 car garages that hid minivans and the occasional regret. Everything began as these things do, small. Lila Chen planted tomato cages in early June. I remember her kneeling in the dirt in those ridiculous floral gardening gloves, smiling at Derek like he'd built the sun for her. The HOA had guidelines, color palettes, hedges trimmed to a precise height, no commercial signage, and the unspoken rule that everything looked like a photograph of suburban calm. Lila's tomatoes were not anarchy. They were 2 crooked rows behind a low picket she'd painted teal. Teal in this neighborhood was the equivalent of a neon billboard. The first complaint was a polite, anonymous note slipped under the Chen's mat. Please remember to observe the covenant regarding front yard alterations. The board, chaired by Marlene Hargrove, took it as a summons. Marlene has the sort of voice that could weather a hurricane and make you think she'd been polite about it. She taped the notice to the HOA bulletin board, always a performative act, then called a courtesy inspection the next Tuesday, as if the association had the authority to smell out sin. You'd think a tomato plant would be a trivial thing to fuss over. You'd think wrong. That little patch of earth was the match in a dry room. People picked a side fast. The Chens, who had moved here from a cramped apartment and wanted to root themselves in something that belonged to them. Those who privately said they admired the courage of open vegetables in public. The committee types who loved rules the way some people love religion. I watched it start because I was nosy and because Lila waved at me over a can of Miracle-Gro and whispered, "You should have seen the note," like a secret she wanted me to keep and then share. I never meant to become a player. I just liked tomatoes. The next HOA meeting was one of those evenings where the fluorescent lights hum like an ominous kettle. We gather at the community center with coffee and paper cups and the kind of etiquette that pretends normalcy. Marlene called the meeting to order with a clipboard balanced like a crown. She had been on the board for longer than anyone could remember. 9 years, maybe 10. And carried herself like the steward of Hearthstone Court's moral universe. She always started with platitudes. We want to preserve property values. We respect our covenants. And we must be fair. Fair, in Marlene's speak, had a curdled quality. Derek and Lila showed up looking nervous in that suburban way people do when they know they're the problem everyone is gossiping about. Derek wore a polo shirt so white it hurt. Lila tried to hide the dirt under her nails with lipstick. They spoke in a way that tried to be conciliatory. We didn't realize we thought it was allowed. But the board had the packet of anonymous notes and a map of infractions. Someone had taken the liberty to mark the Chen's yard with a big red X on a printout of our street. Gary Morales, the landscape contractor who did most of the HOA's common areas, sat with his arms folded like a judge. Gary loved rules when the rules sent work his way. He was wiry and precise, like a gardening guillotine. He had been the unseen hand of Hearthstone's lawns for years, and if you asked around, he had more influence than the bylaws. People joked that he could make your azaleas confess. He and Marlene had a history, that subtle kind of partnership that can be described as strategic. On the dais, Samir Patel, who lives across from us and works nights at the hospital, listened with that exhausted patience of someone who has seen worse. He rarely spoke except when he did, and then it landed. He squinted at the photos of the teal picket and said, "Is that really hurting the neighborhood?" He meant it out loud, which was unexpected and began to make people inch toward the Chens. I remember feeling the room tilt, like someone had slowly turned a snow globe and all the small, polite marbles had begun to roll. The motion was subtle, but once it started, things collected speed. Neighbor alliances, people remembering slights from 3 summers ago, the quiet calculus of who benefited if Derek had to pay fines for an unauthorized alteration. Once you'd sat through a board meeting, you realized how a small thing metastasizes. After the Chin's hearing, fines were levied, a sum that wouldn't bury a house but would gnaw at the margin where you keep extra pride. The notice was formal, 30 days to comply or fines would escalate. Lila cried when she showed me the letter. Not the kind of sobbing that asks for sympathy, but the hollow, surprised sound of someone who thought the world would be fair in exchange for not being loud. So we did what we always do when officialdom overreaches. We whispered. Emails began to circulate with subject lines like Hearthstone concern and please read urgent. Someone posted a blurry photo of Marlene in Gary's truck at the summer fair. Someone else suggested that the reason Gary's company always got the bid for mulch and hedge trimming was that the HOA steering decisions happened in private, at the deli, over coffee. I admit I forwarded a few of those emails. Curiosity is a kind of complicity. I wanted to see how the truth looked when it met our rules. I wanted to see if Marlene would be embarrassed. I wanted to prove we weren't a board of saints. The problem with forwarding gossip in a small lane is it grows roots. People added accusations like fertilizer, Gary had a sweetheart contract, a sister-in-law who worked for the HOA, donations to the association for upkeep, which were oddly large and unaccounted for in the minutes. An anonymous spreadsheet popped up that tracked every bid Gary had won in the last 5 years. The sums didn't add up to charity. Tracy Lowe, who runs a local parenting blog and treats any tiff as clickbait, began an online petition demanding, quote, transparency in allocations. She has a tone that makes everything sound like a lifestyle brand. People signed. People showed up to Marlene's house, not to her door, but across the street, well into the public strip, where you could see a woman in a bright dress clipping roses and looking like the queen of a small public court. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, she smiled like someone who had seen this play before. Seeing the petition float around felt like watching a slow-rolling car accident. You're not obliged to stop, but you slow down and look, and then the guilt sets in because you slowed to stare. I was one of those people who slowed down. Private alliances hardened into factions. Hearthstone had always had communal picnics and a Facebook group where we posted lost cats and recommendations for acupuncturists. Now that same bandwidth became the battleground. There were threads about, quote, community standards and threads about residents, rights. Someone started a private group, Friends for Fair Play, a euphemism for folks who liked the color palette and liked it enforced. Another group, Neighbors for Common Sense, was mostly the people who thought a tomato plant shouldn't be regulated by a document written before anyone even had a front porch. Rosa Alvarez, who lives 2 doors down and runs her own small catering business, organized a potluck. She has a laugh that feels like a hug and a way of dishing out enchiladas that makes arguments more digestible. Rosa's potluck was supposed to be neutral territory, but even food became an emblem of allegiance. Who brought store-bought versus homemade? Who brought a salad with no dressing because they were diet people and wanted to advertise their virtue? Lila brought bruschetta. Derek, surprisingly, brought a store-bought lemon pie because he couldn't cook without burning something, and he admitted it. That act alone made people warmer to him. At the potluck, June Bryant, our elderly neighbor whose husband had died the winter before, sat at the edge with a thermos of tea. June had lived here longer than Marlene had been on the board. She kept a small garden of primroses that were adored by everyone, an unspoken pact of gentility. When June whispered that she thought the HOA was picking on folks who have less, the room leaned in. June's voice carried because it was rare and authoritative in the way of someone who has seen rules change and pockets empty. But the tilt toward empathy was interrupted by a rumor. Someone said Marlene had consulted a lawyer about the Chens, and that the fines could be used as a precedent for other alterations. That phrase, used as a precedent, transformed the landscape. People began to worry that a stray hammock, a brightly painted door, or even a for sale sign in a window meant you could be next. The conversation turned from tomatoes to survival. How tight was the net that the HOA could cast? What else would be deemed uncomely? I watched my neighbors choose camps as if we were selecting teams for a schoolyard game. I kept my hands on my bowl of pasta because one felt glued to the moment, like a participant in a slow-burning confession. Marlene, for her part, was grotesquely calm. She issued a monthly newsletter that read like a manifesto. Covenant engagement is not a suggestion. She sent out reminders for hedges to be trimmed to 3.5 feet and suggested a preferred palette for shutters based on historic neighborhood aesthetics. She also quietly increased the administrative fee line item by a number that was noticeable only if you had sat on budgets before. When asked at a meeting, she shrugged and said just routine adjustments, and people who wanted the world tidy accepted it. But then receipts leaked. I say leaked because that's how secrets slip out when you put them in the margins. An accounting error, a scanned copy, a volunteer with a conscience. The HOA account showed a recurring, quote, landscape management fee that overflowed what anyone could rationalize for a 2-acre association. There were notes, GM mobilization, site prep, Hargrove property, and other entries that smelled of personal projects camouflaged as communal services. The spreadsheet didn't need more explanation. It was self-evident to anyone who knew which strip of lawn looked suspiciously perfect. When the receipts were distributed via an anonymous email to the board and half the neighborhood, the room at the next meeting changed. People who had been quiet suddenly understood what selective enforcement looks like. If Gary's company got 5 times the work, and Marlene's edge was present on the record as advisory, then the covenants were less a rule book than a rent extraction scheme. It felt dirty. Betrayal does that. It turns the familiar into an accusation. Derek, who had been trying to be reasonable through all of this, pushed for a forensic review. He said words like audit and transparency with the clarity of someone who had no reason to romanticize the system. Marlene responded by suggesting mediation and extolling, quote, good governance. The distinction between good governance and retribution depends entirely on who writes the rules. We were beginning to see that our rules had been written by people who benefited from them. I remember the air in the community center as tensing, like muscle before exertion. I had assumed the HOA existed to prevent too many pink flamingos. I didn't expect it to be so adept at turning neighbors into profit centers. It was around this point that small acts of revenge started to appear. Minor, domestic warfares. A hedge was trimmed in an aggressive zigzag across from the Chen's driveway. Someone adjusted the sprinkler timing so their strip was always soggy in the morning and muddy by noon. Trash cans were left in front of certain houses as if deposited by the winds of spite. The payback didn't come as lawsuits at first, but as passive-aggressive horticulture. Lila told me that an envelope of seeds, labeled "For Newbies, Learn the Rules," with a clip of HOA bylaws, had been taped to her gate. The seeds were of a grass that would not grow in our soil. A neighbor's mailbox, newly painted to code, was scratched down one side with a key, a slow vandalism that seemed to say, "We saw you." People began to lock their gates in a place where gates should have been ornamental more than defensive. Tracy Lowe monetized it. She wrote a column that read like a serial, "The Garden Wars of Hearthstone." She took photos with dramatic filters and interviews, with faces contorted into sincerity. If gossip had a fan club, she was the president. That made some folks furious. Others loved the attention. Suddenly our small street was a brand. We hated her and envied her in the same breath. But there was a line. June Bryant's fines accrued because she couldn't keep to the exact line of her privet hedge. The board sent notices. June, on a fixed income, couldn't afford to pay the escalating fees. She slipped into arrears. When a lien was placed on her name, the neighborhood held its breath, not because we weren't nervous that this would happen. We had assumed these bylaws existed to maintain order, but because the subtle cruelty of applying them to someone like June was a moral test none of us had considered. Will we be kinder than our rules? Derek and Samir put together a proposal to help June. They wanted to pay the fines out of a community relief fund. Marlene balked, saying it would create a precedent. Her argument that precedent was a slippery slope ignored the human slope that June teetered on. The conversation turned from legalities to something uglier. Who gets mercy when rules are currency? The moral calculus of mercy versus rules became more personal than public. I started to see what Marlene had been protecting, not property values per se, but a hierarchy. She had friends whose children played in the same schools, who attended the same church potlucks. She preferred neighbors who knew their place. That preference, logically applied, produced favoritism. One night I admitted to myself that I knew more than I liked. I had been the person who answered Marlene's gardening calls for advice. A neighborly thing, right? She would ask me about potluck menus, and I would tell her what hummus recipes didn't devolve to mush. I would drop by with a quilt, and she would tell me about her late husband like it was a complaint and a praise. We had small kindnesses that had a currency of their own. They didn't look like influence until they did. At a public meeting, a fresh face stood up. Ethan Price, a young contractor who had contributed to community projects and had a kind of blunt honesty that made people listen, said, "If the covenants are meant to serve us, then the board must show how the community benefits when we spend thousands on mobilization that looks like someone's private lawn." He didn't say it with irony. He said it like someone who'd seen invoices and hadn't been paid. The room applauded like it was applause for a sermon. Marlene smiled that small, closed smile and said, "We are a community. We try to act with integrity." Her choice of words felt like armor. Integrity in her mouth had been bureaucratized, sanitized. Samir, who had begun to see the patterns, leaned forward and asked about a contract signed in Marlene's name for front yard beautification. The word "signed" had teeth. It implied ownership. It put Marlene on the defensive, and her defenses were designed like bureaucratic tapestries, complex enough to hide a seam. The meeting adjourned with promises of a review. People left hugging and talking in the street like the rain would wash the mud of suspicion away. It didn't. Suspicion is sticky. Things got messier when a journalist from the local paper, not Tracy, someone with a press badge and less appetite for chips and dip, called and asked if anyone had documents. The word expose has a way of galvanizing nerves. Suddenly, emails were forwarded with a purpose. The spreadsheet of Gary's contracts circulated beyond our cul-de-sac to the county. The tone changed from neighborly gossip to public record, which is not the same thing at all. Marlene responded the way people with reputations do, with placards and talking points. "We prioritize fiscal responsibility," she told the reporter. She also insisted the board had no personal interest in contracts, and suggested that any implication otherwise was quote, "hurtful." It was a performance, and performances are often the last resort of people who sense they might lose more than a vote. Derek and Lila, in contrast, started a fundraising page to cover June's fines and to establish a small neighbor relief fund with a modest transparency clause. All donors would see how funds were spent. People wrote in small notes on the donation site, "For June, who always gave me soup when my baby was sick, because rules should protect the weak." The charm of small kindnesses is they are visible. They are the opposite of power hiding in invoices. There was an anonymous counter-strategy. Someone emailed a compilation of neighborhood complaints about the Chen's driveway, alleging habitual blocking during moving days, barbecue smoke offenses, and a long list of items trivial and petty. The intent was clear: muddy the Chens enough to make their moral high ground slippery. If you smear a person with enough trivial accusations, the big ones start to look inevitable. I felt sick seeing that list, because it was the weaponization of everyday life. At night, I walked past June's house and saw the primroses under a small, flimsy support someone had put there. A sticky note on the mailbox read, "Stop the fines." A neighbor. Whoever wrote it didn't sign their name. The anonymity made it both brave and cowardly. I thought about my role in forwarding emails, in smiling at Marlene, in writing to neighbors. Complicity feels like wearing a sweater that itches. You can't decide if you should throw it off and risk the cold. The HOA voted to hire an outside auditor. It was supposed to be a calming, procedural thing. Get the facts, move on. What actually happened was the beginning of the end for a lot of people. The auditor requested documentation. In response, Marlene produced a packet that included redacted invoices, color-coordinated explanations, and a few handwritten notes that looked like apologies. She also produced, interestingly, a list of alleged violations in the neighborhood, stretching back 5 years. It was as if to say, "If you poke at my accounts, we'll poke at your hedges." The auditor asked for bank statements that showed deposits for quote 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 is KTO. The team's questions were simple and relentless. Who authorized these payments? Who signed on behalf of the HOA? And why did household beautification appear as a line? There was a small, ugly sound, the sound organizations make when their wheels come off. Scrawled justifications, suddenly missing receipts, employees who no longer worked for Gary's company. I realized then that the real power of an HOA is in its ability to move money without many eyes watching. It was mundane, slow corruption, pay to play through maintenance contracts, reciprocity disguised as patronage, favors disguised as necessity. There was no theft in the cinematic sense, no masked man with a bag of cash. Instead, it was a pattern of decisions that favored a small circle. People who benefited might have thought it was community improvement, which is often how privilege convinces itself it's benevolent. Ethan, whose contracting business had lost bids to Gary, testified with the bluntness of someone who'd lost work. He showed estimates that were lower than the HOA's payments and implied the contracts had been steered. "We do the work right the first time," he said, "and we're transparent." That transparency turned out to be the kind that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that reveals not only what was spent, but why. At home that night, I found myself unable to sleep, listening to the neighbor's porch light click off, imagining ledgers with private lines. I had always thought of rules as a kind of security. Now I saw them as a tool that can be wielded unevenly. Let's be honest, I liked the uniform shutters, but I liked them more when they weren't weaponized. The auditor's preliminary report was leaked, and the cul-de-sac drank it like it was a cold, necessary thing. It showed irregularities and recommended a full forensic audit. It also named names, not in a dramatic headline, but in the matter-of-fact way accountants list signatures. The signature on several documents bore Marlene's hand. The leak was an act of vengeance disguised as public service, and we celebrated like it was a moral victory. Marlene denied wrongdoing and called the leak, quote, malicious. She countersued for defamation. The person who had leaked the report remained anonymous. People split into practical factions once again. Some wanted to keep the matter out of court. Others wanted Marlene gone immediately. Meanwhile, June's lien remained unresolved. The neighborhood seemed to waver between righteous indignation and the alarm of lawsuits that might drain our small coffers. One night, I received an anonymous letter that read, "You know more than you say." It was the sort of note you expect in mysteries you read at bed dialogue. It had the counterfeit intimacy of someone who wants to turn you into an accomplice or a scapegoat. I didn't respond. I folded it and put it in a drawer with old warranty cards and the kind of things you put away because you don't want to think about them. At the community center, tempers flared. Gary defended himself vaguely. He spoke about professional standards, which sounded like legalese for "I was doing the job." The board bought into the defense as if they needed to. Partisans argued about intention versus outcome. Someone probably quoted a line about intent matters. It didn't. Outcomes had been unequal, and people knew it. When outcomes favor a piano mover and a hedge trimmer, the conclusion is almost inevitable. I watched Marlene grow thinner and more defensive. She began to carry herself differently, primly editorialized. Her smile no longer reached her eyes. The smile a person keeps when they know they're on notice is a fragile thing, a practiced thing. It was then that a realization rose in me like a slow tide. I had been part of the machinery. Not in invoices, not directly in signatures, but in the casual acceptance of, "This is how things are." My silence had been a kind of workmanship. The neighborhood took sides in small logistical ways. People who wanted to oust Marlene attended every meeting, took meticulous notes, and made public records requests. People who were loyal to her, or who benefited from the existing state of things, called these inquiries mob mentality. There was the inevitable playground of revenge in little courtesies withheld, invitations unsent, holiday lights ignored, a plate of cookies left cooling on a stoop without knocking. I found myself minimizing my interactions because I didn't want my lunch to become a subpoena. But a curious thing happened. The more the situation magnified, the more mundane the acts of human tenderness became meaningful. Derek and Lila would mow June's lawn on Saturday mornings as if it were nothing. They never posted pictures of it. They did it because their shame had a conscience, and because they were there on a Saturday, and June's hands couldn't reach the clippers. One evening at the halfway point of the audit, Marlene came to my house. She carried homemade biscotti in a tin. We sat on my back porch like two people who had history. She asked me, with a voice that tried on trust like a new coat, whether I would speak in her defense at the next hearing. She leaned in, and for a moment our shared past, the potlucks, the neighborly appointments, made the request confusing. I wanted to be the person who could save someone she had befriended, but I also wanted fairness. I said, "Marlene, if you have nothing to hide, let it be clear." That felt like righteousness. She exhaled and said, "You used to be kinder to me." It landed like a small stone. The truth I didn't say was that I had forwarded the spreadsheet to a reporter because something in me wanted the truth to be known. I had not meant harm. I had meant accountability. The biscotti tasted like an apology, the way things taste when they have been heated and cooled for too long. It was the admission that marked a change. I told myself I was doing the right thing, and part of me selfishly liked that I had become part of the story. It made me feel less invisible. What I hadn't calculated was how the exposure would ripple. Secrets have a way of surfacing other things. After my admission, telling Marlene I had sent documents, our relationship changed. She stopped asking for recipe advice and started asking about my opinions on bylaws. It was as if she wanted to recruit me back into the fold, and I had already crossed an invisible line. The neighborhood ate that narrative. Evelyn, once silent, turned whistleblower. Some applauded. Some called me self-righteous. The forensic audit wound through our lives like a persistent thread. Gary's contracts were scrutinized. Some were found to be appropriate, some were not. The auditors recommended restitution and stricter bidding processes. Marlene's position became untenable. She was asked to step down pending a vote. She resisted. The drama moved from whispers to legal correspondence. The board meetings became courts of public opinion. And then a kindness that mattered more than the finances happened. The community, after much debate and with some in private dissent, not everyone agreed, voted to remove the lien on June's house. The money to clear it came from a modest neighborhood relief account funded by different donors, some anonymous, many not. It was a gesture that belonged more to moral redemption than fiscal prudence. June cried and said, "I always thought people would be better than a rule. We all pretended we'd known that all along." Marlene left. She packed her boxes slowly, like someone moving through stages of an end. She did not go quietly. There were letters and one defamation claim, but ultimately she was out. There was a sense of victory in the air, but also a hollow note. Removing one person hadn't solved the way we had let rules calcify into advantage. The temptation was to feel cleansed. The reality was that rot had been found and needed tending. I told myself then that the story was healing. The truth would save us. But truth is messy. It doesn't stop sneaky behaviors. It only makes them interesting to talk about over coffee. The aftermath was quieter, but more complicated. Gary's company lost contracts but didn't vanish. He remarried his business relationship into another sphere, a quiet rebranding. Some neighbors who had benefited from the old arrangements apologized. A few didn't. Tracy Lowe wrote a multi-part piece called After the Garden Rule, and everyone had an opinion about whether the coverage was fair. She argued we'd learned a lesson about transparency. I thought the lesson was about limits, about how small power structures can get comfortable. We established a new bidding process. We mandated open bids, public minutes, and a 3-person review for anything above a petty threshold. It felt like progress, formal and administrative. We also created a small neighbor relief fund with clearly stated criteria. I sat on that new committee for a while. Perhaps because I thought doing so would make me righteous. Perhaps because I wanted to prove I'd earned the stripes of responsibility. What surprised me was how fragile trust remained. Some neighbors still picked up their phones to text in a complaint first, more reflexive than charitable. People still judged a brightly painted door. The petty grievances returned like perennial weeds. I came to understand that you can change a system but not human inclination. People will always seek advantage if it's there to be sought. June's primroses bloomed that spring like nothing had happened. She baked once more, bringing small parcels to folks who had helped. She hugged us, and in those embraces she seemed to grant forgiveness without a big speech. I wished I could be that open, to give forgiveness like a pastry handed over with ease. I had learned to be less sure of my edges. There was one final, quiet revelation. A year after Marlene's departure, an elderly woman who had been on the board decades ago, someone who had watched the neighborhood change since before any of us had the right zoning notices, approached me at a community cleanup day. She said, "Evelyn, truth is a messy thing. You did something, you made waves, but you also made people see themselves. Her words felt like both balm and judgment. I told her I regretted betraying a friend. She shrugged. A friend who used power with that much ease isn't a friend you keep at all costs. It was a hard thing to hear. My sense of loyalty had been tangled with my sense of justice. The two can be in conflict. I had learned that standing for transparency sometimes looks like cruelty to those we care about. That realization didn't bring me peace, but it brought clarity. There was also irony. After all our efforts to be fair, somebody painted their garage door teal in the dead of night, a direct, almost comic defiance. The person who did it never revealed themselves, and when the board insisted on repainting it to approved neutral, the neighbor fixed the coat again and again, like a small performance art piece about resistance. We laughed, because if you can't laugh in a cul-de-sac, where can you? In the end, the street became less like a painted postcard and more like a living thing. Imperfect, sometimes kind, sometimes petty, mostly human. We had learned to ask for invoices and to be suspicious of favors. We had also learned that empathy matters more than compliance sometimes. Sitting on my porch now, years after the first tomato cages, I watch kids play in a yard that may or may not have permissioned flower beds. I see Derek and Lila sip coffee on their stoop. Samir walks his dog, late as ever. Rosa is out catering an event, and June still waters her primroses at dawn. A new board sits in comfortable chairs and posts minutes like a promise. The relief fund still exists. It has helped 2 young families and 1 elderly man get through fines that would have broken them. I sometimes think about the ways in which a small community's dramas feel disproportionately large. That is human nature. We amplify stories until they loom like mountains. We do it out of fear, out of boredom, out of the desire to matter. When I tell this story to friends who never lived here or to neighbors who lived it, I tell them the meat of it. Rules are necessary, but who wields them matters. That is the heart of the story we lived. If you ask me if I regret my part, I'll tell you yes and also no. I regret the way friendships splintered and the petty cruelties that followed. But I don't regret that a lien was lifted on a woman's home, or that the bidding process is now public. The irony is that in fighting a rule about a tomato plant, we learned about the corrosive power of small privileges and how easily they become paychecks for a closed group. So if you ever drive by Hearthstone Court, notice the mismatched shutters and the one teal picket fence that refuses to be conformist. Notice the primroses by June's gate. And if you ask me how we survived it, I'll say we did, because we couldn't help seeing each other in all our faults and kindnesses, and because someone finally decided that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. We paid in friendships, in gossip, in late-night meetings, and in apologies. We also paid in change. That, oddly enough, felt like progress.